Good morning. My name is Taylor Riley. I'm a mortgage consultant here at UFirst Credit Union. Got Spence Minson with me. I am ecstatic to be able to do this podcast webinar today. This is something that I've wanted to do for 6 years, where we brought in a professional appraiser, ask them questions, and be able to find out how a value of your home is made, so that we can be able to understand, as home buyers and home owners, potential homeowners, what goes into that value. So I'm really excited to have Spence here. I've known Spence for a really long time. I got to know him when I first started at the credit union, and know his wife and his family, and it's been a great relationship. He's been invaluable to me, so I'm really excited to have you here today to be able to go through and talk about this. Why don't you introduce yourself? Give your backgrounds, qualifications, and
Sure.
so they can be able to know who you are.
Great. Well, I'm glad to be here. So I'm Spence Minson. I've been appraising in the residential field for coming up 19 years this October. So I've been in the field for a long time. In the appraisal industry, typically you go through the training and you get licensed, and then the highest level of certification is called Certified Residential Appraiser if you're licensed to do residential work, single family homes and residential land, condos, and then multiplexes up to fourplexes. That's what I am licensed to do, and again, been doing that for close to 19 years, so
Okay.
excited to be here.
Have you ever dabbled in business or complexes or anything like that, or has it always been residential that you've done?
Just residential.
Okay.
Yep. And it requires additional hours of training it's called a general appraiser, and they can do commercial work,
Okay.
depending on what type of specialty they go into.
One of the things that I know that we've talked about in the past is that specifically with homes in Park City, where I will give you a call, and we've got condo, hotels, stuff like that. So are you licensed in certain zip codes, cities, counties? How does your licensure work that way?
No, that's a good question. So I'm licensed in the state of Utah, and in the appraisal industry, what we call geographic competency, which means I'm competent in certain areas where I have experience and I understand the markets. And so to answer that question specifically, I work in Salt Lake County, Utah County, Davis County, Weber County, Tooele County, Summit and Wasatch from time to time. And then I've done work in Juab, very rarely Morgan, and Box Elder.
Wow.
So if an order comes in or somebody calls in and says, hey, we need an appraisal done, and they're like, I'm up in Bear Lake, I typically would say, well, let me look at the property and see if I can either become geographically competent, understand the market, look at the research, and if not, then I say, well, you probably need to find someone that's more competent in that area. But that's what we typically say. I'm licensed to do anything in Utah, but I look at areas where I feel comfortable and I have enough experience to provide an accurate report.
Excellent. Well, I'm glad that you're here. We're going to get started. If you have questions, put them into the computer. When we go through with what we're going to talk about, we'll then turn to the questions and get those answered at the very end. So any question that you have, please submit it, and we can be able to talk about that and get some answers. And if we don't get them addressed, we'll have a list of questions we can be able to reach out to you. Also, when we get done with this will be available on our platforms, and so we will talk to you about how you can be able to access that if you have to leave sometime in the middle. So Spence, we'll get started. One of the questions that I have from everybody when they're sitting at my desk and talking to me is, what is happening with home values? Where are we projecting in the next 12 months? So from an appraiser's perspective, what is the current market looking like? What is the current state in terms of values, and where do you project things to go in the next 12 months?
Okay, I get asked that. That's probably the main question I get asked as well. What's happening to the market now? Where do you think it'll go? So the first part is what's happening to the market now. I would say probably we're in June. Last 2022, I believe March and April is when the rates started to go up. Mortgage rates is what we're talking
absolutely.
about. And so when that happened, and I'm trying not to get too much into the weeds, but let me kind of explain how it works. So we started to see the level of work that was coming in, people refinancing their homes, people buying homes, go down.
Yeah.
And when that happens, when there's not as much demand for that, typically the market is going to drop.
Okay.
So we saw values start to go down probably July of 2023. Legitimately, we had data that said values of homes are going down.
Mm-hmm.
And that lasted until about, I would say, January or February of this year, where it was planing out. And now I would say it's on the rise, but it really depends on where you're at. If you're to take an overall snapshot of the Wasatch Front from, I would say, Santaquin up to North Ogden, and from Grantsville to, Heber City,
Mm-hmm.
it's probably gone up in the past couple of months, 2 or 3%.
Okay.
And now that's taking into account every home, residential home.
Okay.
So that's what the market's been doing.
Mm-hmm.
And right now, I think if you were to buy and sell a house in a month or two, you may make 1% or 2%.
Okay.
So where the market's going, we all wish we had a crystal ball, and I think the realtors that I've talked to, the loan professionals that I've talked to in the past 15 years have been right maybe 25% of the time.
If that.
Yeah. Now, if there's an event where, certain things happen, typically in an election year, there's more demand, and the rates, the government doesn't want to be the jerk in this, and so okay, we need to do something with the rates.
Yeah.
And so things go up. In Utah, to answer the question where the market's going, especially in the Wasatch Front, this is a very desirable location. And believe it or not, the Salt Lake metropolitan area is top 20 in cost per square foot per salary of people. And to think of that even 15 years ago, like, hey, Salt Lake City is one of the most expensive places to live.
So real quickly on that, explain that one more time. So just in case people got lost there. So when we're talking about how much people are making to how much money they're spending per square foot, Salt Lake's in the top 20 cities in the country.
Right.
Okay.
And that means how much of your money is going towards your mortgage payment.
Okay.
We're one of the top ones in the country.
Okay.
Now that can be good and bad because a lot of businesses are here. It's a great place to work. Most people think that it's a great place to live.
Yeah.
And so what we're seeing and what is trending is that we are in a shortage of homes, which means typically when there's high demand and low supply, what are the prices? Do they go up?
Yeah.
And that's what we're seeing. So a lot of these areas in Salt Lake and surrounding areas are either repurposing existing land to go higher density, which means more homes per acre, townhomes, condos, or just smaller lots.
Yeah.
Or they're looking at areas that they're going to expand to build that aren't built out yet.
Okay.
Now in Salt Lake Valley, you've got southwest portion of the valley, and that's about it. And then you've got certain areas that have larger parcels of land that have been developed in the south portion of the valley and sometimes in the central part of the valley. Now, what does that mean? It means that Utah County is, I think, the fastest growing county for new home builds, even faster than Washington County. And that's getting built out. And so until that catches up, I think we're going to see a rise in values of homes and also homes that are just going up in price.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I saw something, and people ask me all the time, is this a good time to buy a home? And there was something that I read a few months ago that in the last 80 years, if we look at home values going up or home values going down, only 7 of those years in the last 80 have home values decreased. So you got 73 years where they've increased.
Yeah.
I started to see something that you did or that you have talked about where there's kind of a catch up of what's happening. So when values, it seemed like they peaked in the summer of 2022 would be kind of what I saw. And then when people were coming in and doing things in late 2022 or early 2023, where they were possibly moving from a home equity line of credit to a fixed rate second mortgage, we were seeing if we could repurpose those appraisals. And we couldn't, because they were all on a decline of value, anywhere between 3 to 5%, 4 to 6%, some of them said 5 to 10%, which was a big cause for concern for people, where they see that and they get really scared. But it almost seemed like there was this artificial bump at some point, and they kind of leveled out to where there really wasn't a decrease. It's just there was an artificial rise, so there was an artificial decrease, and they've been pretty. 2022 seemed to be pretty steady, and I agree that there's been kind of an increase that's been happening over the last 3 months.
Right.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right, talk to me about an appraisal. So I wanted to hear what the process is from the time that somebody orders an appraisal and you see that email come through, or you get that call, to when you hit the send button to send them the email for the report. Talk about what you do step by step, so that we can understand from your perspective what's going on.
Okay. So there's a couple of things that we'll work through with what it takes to go from what we call an engagement, which means at the beginning, and we'll talk about a lending appraisal, meaning a lender calls and says, hey, we need an appraisal done for, let's say, a refinance.
Okay.
So for the most part, lenders now need kind of a third party that they order things through. And so I get an appraisal from the UView Credit Union and their central lending department, and they say, okay, we need this appraisal done. And what happens is they send me an email, and it has information on there for the property, who I need to contact to access the property, and then what type of what we call the intended use. And it could say it's a refinance for this home.
Okay.
So my job from that point is to accept that, and then I reach out to whoever the contact would be to access that property. So once that's scheduled, then I do what's called, I call the research portion. I typically look at county records. I look at the local MLS, the Wasatch Front MLS. I look at the home if it's been sold recently or listed recently, and then I get as much information on that property as possible.
What are you looking for in the county? When you go into the county records, what are you looking for?
Typically, if on the county, I'm looking for information on the lot that may be more detailed than the Wasatch Front MLS. Okay. Taxes, anything that would be an issue if there's a lien on the property for the title work. And I garner that myself through research. Okay. The other way that I look at it is when I'm talking to the homeowner, or if it's a purchase transaction, I talk to typically the listing agent and say, tell me about the house. When was the home built? I'm looking at this on the county records. Is that right? It's a 2-story. Yes, it's a 2-story. I'm showing it's this big of a property. And they say, well, honestly, 99% of the time, that's yes, that's right. And it's that 1% of the time, if I forget to ask for him, heaven forbid, it's a rambler. I did one that was a rambler, and it was 1,200 square feet. And I said, well, it's showing this on the county records. And they said, actually, we added a second story and we expanded out the back, and we bought the neighbor's lot. I said, oh, that's kind of different. Yeah. So that way I can research the correct values of that property, or things that add value to it. Okay. So I get as much information up front, and then we schedule a time to go out and see it. And so at that point, I pull preliminary sales, and quite a few to look at as I'm going out and researching the property. Mm-hmm. Once I arrive at the property, what I do is I measure the home, and that means if it's a 2-story, I measure each level. So and then when we do a sketch on a property, that's going to have different things. It's going to have your main level. If you have a second level, that'll be disseminated out. The garage, porches, patios, detached garages, or detached space, as well as your basement. All of that's different.
Do you have a good idea of how much the home is worth before you visit the home? Or is this just, are you still in fact finding where you don't want to come up with a value before you get all of the information?
Right. That's a good question. It's, for the most part, I have in what the market is saying, I have a range that this home is probably going to be in this range of value based on what I've researched. Okay. And then within that range, that's what narrows down once I get to the house and say, okay, they've done this and this to the house. So after the sketch, walk through the house or draw the layout, which means where are the bedrooms, where are the bathrooms, kitchens. If it's got structures on site, which means you have real estate, which means your land. And then an improvement is a home, a garage, landscaping, anything that you've added to that offense that adds value to your property. And so we're looking at that and saying, okay, what kinds of things does this home have? How big is the home? And all of that is done through the on-site inspection. I typically ask when I leave, do you have any questions for me? And some of these questions that you're asking come up. What do you think is going on? And most people say, no, I think we're good. And then they ask, when is the appraisal going to be done?
Yeah.
And so once that's done, I drive the comparables, look at the neighborhood, to look at the homes that I'm using for comparables to that property. Is there anything that's going to adversely affect or influence the value, which means I'm looking at a house, oh, it's underneath a bunch of power lines. Oh, I'm looking at a house that's actually got more of a view than the Wasatch Front MLS said. Or its sides or front's a busy street.
Yeah.
Anything else that is going to detract from that, its side's commercial.
Yeah.
So that's why we drive the comparables, to look at the neighborhood. Now, I've been doing this long enough. I've been in, I think, every neighborhood in the Salt Lake Valley, almost Davis and Utah as well, counties. And I kind of know what's going on, but to drive by, to take a picture, and to take notes on the comparables that I'm using.
So real quickly, I've noticed this on the comparables. I never even thought about that. So you're saying that you drive to the comparables that you're using to be able to see those homes with your own eyes. And then the photos that are of the comparable in the appraisal, you're the one that took that. That's not on a general site that you're pulling from. I don't know why I would have thought that, but that.
No, for the most part, yes. Now there's times where, especially in the summer, and you're driving by a house and here's a guy in a black CRV that's taking a picture. Now, is that legal for me to do? Yes, it is. If I was a homeowner and I saw that and I didn't know what the appraisal industry was, it makes you a little bit uncomfortable.
Yeah.
I've probably had my license plate checked hundreds of times. Who's this guy? But we do take a picture if possible. If there's something that's obstructing it, a moving van, a bunch of kids out front, I don't take the picture, but I just make sure that I take notes on anything that would be of note. And once that's done, which means that's all my job for out in the field. So I've measured the home, I've done the on-site inspection, I've driven the comparables, go back to the office, and then we fill out the appraisal form. For lending transactions, 95% of it's going to be what's called a 1004 form. And that's got all your information. Most people have probably seen an appraisal before, an appraisal report. And that gives all the information on the subject property, the neighborhood, the site, the improvements. We grid out what we call it the comparables, and then add that information. And then I look at what the market is doing, and that's where the adjustments come from. Say, okay, well, this home has a 2-car garage, this one has a 3. Well, this home has a 2-car garage, that one has a 3, but it's a tandem, which means it's a 2-car, but it's deep. That one's got a basement finish, this one doesn't. So anything like that, bigger lot, smaller lot, views, no views, all of that goes into account when we're doing the appraisal report. Then I look at it, and it's always, you're gonna have a range of values. Most of the time I have 4 sales and 2 listings, which means an under contract and an active. That tells me and you, the lender, what is the market doing? Where is it going? So all of that we take into account. There's not a lot more to it, but that's kind of what we learn. And then we provide an opinion of market value. It's not a fact. It's an opinion of what the value is.
So talk about the opinion, because that's one thing I've started over the last couple of years, probably saying, I try and use the same phrases with everybody in what I'm doing. And I changed my phrase on this, where it was, this is the opinion of this appraiser. And you may, if you have 4 appraisers go out, you probably are going to get 4 different values. Now, they shouldn't be wildly different, but there is going to be some different variation depending on what they deem to be value of X, Y, and Z compared to the other individual. How much change or how different do you think an appraisal would be if you had 3 appraisers go out on a home, what kind of range do you think that you would get if it's just a standard middle class home that's in Mill Creek?
Yeah. So what we look at is, this question gets asked a lot, especially in our education classes that we take. If you had 3 or 4 or 5 appraisers, how different would you be? And I like to say, if you're within 2 to 3%, you're doing it right.
Yeah.
Now, you said, probably a standard home, let's say it's a bungalow in Mill Creek, that's 1,000 square feet on each level. You're going to have a lot of comparables because you have neighborhoods that are similar.
Okay.
Let's say I go up and I do a home in Park City that's $4 million.
Yeah.
And you've got comparables that range from 3.1 to 5.2. And you've looked at everything else. You may get a little bit more of a range of value, but that's why the expertise of what knowing the area, what adds to value, what takes away is important. So 2 to 3%, if you had 3 or 4 appraisers, they should be within that range. If you're more than that, then either somebody's missing something or something else that we need to look at.
Well, that makes sense. I mean, if you're looking at, a $500,000 home when we're going through, when you're talking 2 to 3%, $10,000 to $15,000, but on a $4 million home, it's substantially more. I'm doing the math right, $80,000 to $120,000 difference. So, that makes sense with what we have there. One of the things that I've thought about and why I really wanted to do this was this question right here. So if you have a family that has $25,000 or $35,000 and they want to maximize the value of their home in terms of some sort of remodel or refresh or do something to the home, what would you as an appraiser recommend that they do to their home to say they're possibly going to sell their home in 24 months? They're thinking about it. I might sell my home, I might not. What is something that they could be able to do with that money, or a variety of things to really help boost that value as much as possible?
Okay, you said 25,000?
Yeah, somewhere in that range. Yeah.
Okay. This is an answer that most people hate, but it's the nature of what I've learned is it depends.
Okay.
So for example, if you have a home that's in relatively good condition, meaning it doesn't have any deferred maintenance, meaning you don't have anything that really needs to be fixed in order for people to occupy and use that home and its utilities. For the most part, if you have 25,000 and let's say your home is worth 600,000 right now, and you're looking to, let's do it 2 ways really quick.
Okay.
Let's say you're looking to sell it and you have 25,000. Most people talk to a realtor and every realtor may give you a different answer. We've heard the commercials, hey, if you put a new front door on your house or a new garage door, that's 3%.
I've heard that.
Yeah. Would I say it's false advertising? Kind of a little bit, because it depends on where you're at. So for 25,000, what I would recommend that people do is you can take a home, because everything's more expensive now, and say let's decrease the effective age. Now, what does that mean?
Okay.
So when you walk into a house, let's say it was built in 1995, and you want to walk into that house and make it feel like it's 2015, or even 2020. Paint. Now people have their own versions of what painting means. I've seen houses that's they personalize their paint, and that's great. But 95% of if you have a very red or a very lime green room, someone's going to paint that when you move out. And it doesn't show as good because that's your personal taste. That's totally fine, but it's not really for the open market to say, well, I'm gonna have to paint that. Maybe I'm gonna pay less because I have to paint it. So a fresh coat of paint. Fixtures. So light fixtures, plumbing fixtures, some of those can be expensive. You don't need to go too far into it. But a lot of people look at a home and say, well, you don't have any recessed lighting and this room is dark. So lighting and light fixtures, meaning a nice bright home, typically is going to give you more value and more of a selling benefit. Oh, let's see. Some people will do baseboards and I call it base and case, so baseboard finish work of the home. That's not necessarily an issue unless you've got dogs, pets, kids that scratch up things. You've got a bunch of marks on it. That is it's an eyesore. So let's see.
These are detailed type things that
Yeah.
most people could be able to do on their own. Your
do.
answers are wildly different than what I was anticipating.
Yeah.
So, and those are things that really don't, like, you could get a lot of value for your money if you're talking about light fixtures. I mean, if you're replacing every light fixture in your home, and even if they're $250 a piece, you're only going to be into that $1,500, maybe $2,000, and that's
Right.
something that could spruce up every bit of your house, rather than saying dump this $15,000 into this bathroom to make this bathroom amazing.
Right. And we're still kind of talking about if you want to sell the house. The other thing is, let's see, appliances. Now, we just redid our kitchen last year, and I think we sold one of our kids to pay for the appliances. We've been in the house for a while. We want to stay there for the rest, forever, hopefully. And you can spend between $6,000 and $7,000 at Home Depot or RC Really for stainless steel oven, dishwasher, range hood, and a fridge. You can also spend $25,000 on appliances. So that's one thing I wouldn't recommend. If you're going to sell the house, don't break your budget on appliances. Meaning, if you want to get a Thermador range top and a fridge, it's going to be about $15,000. They're great, they're wonderful, but don't do that if you're going to sell the house because the other people are like, hey, I'm getting a deal. That is not a market for market value for your dollar. So appliances, but I wouldn't go too expensive. Let's see, there's a couple of other things that people may bring up if you're selling the house that are going to be a question if your roof life is less than 3 years. Now, most roofs for let's say a 1,500 square foot Rambler are going to be between $12,000 and $15,000 to tear it off, resheet it, reshingle it on a standard roof. That's expensive, but that's going to be something that someone's going to negotiate with you as a buyer to say, well, your roof is in bad shape, I'm going to pay less. Now, on the front of the house, you could use that money if you have a home that if it has a little bit of a dated look, even a coat of paint on the outside of your house. That does get a little bit more expensive. That could be 5 to 10 if they really do a good job and they do all your trim and stuff. But stucco especially, and even vinyl and aluminum you can paint. And I've driven up to homes that I saw it the week before and they painted it. I'm like, that looks really good. Now, does that affect my opinion of value? No, but I have to look at what the market says about other homes that have been updated.
So one of the things that I hear from or constantly is when I sit down with somebody and I'm just like, oh, how much do you think your home is worth? And they'll say, well, Zillow says this. And so I always have to take that with a grain of salt because Zillow, I don't know if people know this, but you put the information into Zillow. You can change the Zillow value if you go in and you can update photos and different stuff like that. But so they'll say that and they're like, well, what have you done to the home? Because I helped them purchase this home 2 years ago. Now they're coming and they're like, well, I've done a new AC unit. I've done a new windows. I put on a new roof. Those sorts of things, not my opinion, but I've always thought, well, those are maintenance things. Those are not things that really are increasing the value of the home per se, because those are things that as a homeowner you have to do. Is that accurate? How much do those three things, if somebody did that and put in a brand new AC unit, brand new windows, brand new roof, how much is that going to increase the value of the home?
It's another one of those things that I would tell people, well, it depends. So what I look at it, let's say someone did all three of those things. They put in new windows, which is that's more of a maintenance issue, but it's also an aesthetic issue. And if people are buying a home, that's probably the main thing that they buy if they don't have them is windows that are going to increase their utility, meaning lower their fuel energy costs. And that's huge.
Real quickly on that, I know that there's a difference between spending like $8,000 on windows and spending $20,000 on windows. And I know the salesman talked me into spending the $20,000 on windows, and they look great, much better than when I did on my last home with the $8,000 windows. But how much does that affect the value of the home in terms of, or would it for that extra $10,000, $20,000 or $10,000, $15,000 you might spend on those nice windows?
Okay, so let's go back to our $600,000 house. And if you were to spend the $8,000, say these are brand new triple pane vinyl windows with standard locking mechanisms, and they put them in, it looks great. that's probably going to get you dollar for dollar at least.
Okay.
Now, if you were to have a $2 million house and you put $8,000 windows in, that's something that it almost goes with the territory and marketability, and say, this is a beautiful house.
Yeah.
And it's got a tiny little master bath.
Mm-hmm.
That's a problem.
Okay.
And so some people expect, well, I'm paying this much money for this type of a home. I want to have windows that make sense, the way they look and the way that they utilize energy.
Mm-hmm.
So to answer your question, does it make a difference? It depends on the cost of the overall home. If you just spend $20,000, appraiser comes in and you say, well, it's got brand new windows. Unless you tell me that it's got these expensive windows, then I look at other homes that have more expensive windows to compare it to.
Yeah.
I'm not going to know.
That makes sense.
And it probably isn't going to give you that value that you think.
Yeah.
So that's one thing that it's great when you have an appraiser in your home. Give them a list of things that you've done,
Mm-hmm.
when they were done, and how much they cost to do.
Okay.
And that's whether you're selling a home or you're getting a refinance. That's one of the main things that I love it when people have a list for me of things they've done. Now, I'm trusting that information is true. You could have someone say, I've done all this stuff and it was $110,000.
Mm-hmm.
Then it's my job to look and see what,
Yeah.
if that's actually the case or not.
Yeah. It almost seems like, well, when I'm checking out that dollar for dollar on the cheaper windows, that's a big point to be able to take a look at. And then also, it sounds like you need to put a cover letter or a cover sheet like you would on a resume to give to an appraiser when they come out.
It's helpful.
Yeah, excellent.
Definitely.
Okay. Real quickly, spend 30 seconds. New roof, metal roof compared to a traditional shingle. I've seen things recently where people are taking a roof that maybe 10 years old and they're spraying a new chemical on there to increase the life of the roof. If somebody has a metal roof to a traditional roof, if they've done that, is that something that would be helpful in terms of value, or is that just going to help them with the longevity of their roof, because it's going to save them money?
Probably the latter. It helps them with the longevity of their roof. Most people look, and some of the metal roofs now they look like shingles.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them have the sheeting. It's rare. And some people, for a metal roof like that may be a deterrent. Like when it rains, it is absolutely deafening in this house. And so that's typically something that the value of the long-term value of your roof versus the aesthetic look of the roof.
That makes sense.
And if you have a question about the waterproofing over the shingles, I don't know too much about that, but I would definitely call someone you trust, a roofer, and say, am I getting ripped off by spraying this stuff on my roof? Does it really help or not?
Makes sense. Let's talk about location. I know one time specifically that I had with you, and then my own experience, so I'll give both of those. I live on 10th East in Sandy, and when you came out and did the appraisal, I think there was a 5 or 10% decrease on my home for being on 10th East, which was surprising to me, because that's not, it is a busier street. It does cause noise for us. So like, it makes sense the longer that I'm in that home, why there's that decrease that was there. But that was something that was just kind of eye popping. And the other thing is, I remember we had an agent that I did a refinance for, and you two got into I'll say a debate, because at the end there wasn't a consensus on her home. I want to say it was 19th East in the Sugar House area, that she was below it, and all of her comps were above it. But I know in Sandy growing up, if you lived above 13th East compared to below 13th East, there was a value change. Yeah. Talk about the location of the home and how much that can affect the property value, because most people are sentimental about their homes. They think that their homes, it's always something, well, my home's nicer than that home that just sold down the street.
Right.
How much does that play into it? What can you see in terms of being on one side of 45th East to the other side in South Salt Lake and Murray? Like, how does that affect the value of the home?
Okay, and that's a huge question. So let's talk about a busy road first. And we call it, in the appraisal industry, it's external obsolescence, which means what adds or detracts, typically in this case, detracts from value from a home. So we talked about power lines, we talked about busy street, we talked about commercial, and there's a couple other things that we don't hear about too much, but that's external obsolescence. That takes away the value. So when I look at homes, what we do for the most part is we look at other homes, let's say, that are similar to yours as far as the location.
Mm-hmm.
Now, your home, if I remember right, sides
Yeah.
10th East.
Yeah, it does.
And that's different. So what that means is we're looking at the market, how that affects your home based on road noise, not road, what's a good way to say this?
Safety?
Safety is one, but it's just the inconvenience of coming off a busy road and pulling into your driveway,
Mm-hmm.
and even worse, pulling out of your driveway.
Yeah.
Now, we have roads that have shoulders, and we have roads that have multiple lanes, and so it's different. But that's why we look at other homes that may side a comparable street, because 10th East is busy, but it's not that busy.
Mm-hmm.
So I put in my appraisal reports, okay, Taylor's home sides 10th East, and it's a 35 to 40 mile an hour road. And I used another home that was on a comparable street, and then I adjusted out accordingly.
Okay.
So siding a busy street, backing a busy street. We've had people ask, well, I back I-215, but I have a 12-foot sound wall. Does that make a difference? And then I say, well, it depends. Again,
it depends.
So we look at other homes that may be similar to that. And I've done some, a comparable analysis on roads that back, let's say a freeway that has a sound wall. And some people, it's kind of 50-50. They say, well, we kind of like, we don't have any backyard neighbors, and I have this massive wall
Mm-hmm.
that I don't have to worry about.
Mm-hmm.
And my kids, it's great. Others are like, I want to live that close to the freeway. It's loud.
Yeah.
So that may be a little bit different. But location as far as busy street, that's what we look at. Location as far as views, that's a positive. Okay, what kind of a view is it? I did an appraisal a couple of years ago up in the Capitol Hill area, and I had one comp that was looking out over the Salt Lake Valley, meaning directly south, and I had one that was overlooking the southwest to west portion of the valley around the corner in a gated community that overlooked kind of the lake, but it was the industrial area.
Mm.
Now, some people, it's amazing for sunsets.
Yeah.
But the difference that we researched for the homes that were on the south facing versus that other side were probably 5 to 10%. And that's just looking at what the market is reacting to.
Yeah.
And the views. Location in areas, and as an appraiser, I mean, we can't be biased to say, well, this area has certain influences or not. I have to look at what homes sold for without any other bias of any kind.
Mm-hmm.
And so somebody may say, well, I live, like you had mentioned, below 7th East.
Mm-hmm.
I live above 7th East. And let's say it's White City and Sandy versus above 13th East. Does that make a difference? Well, in the market, it does.
Yeah.
But I have to prove that. Say,
Mm-hmm.
well, this pocket of homes averages about 410,000, and a similar pocket of homes above 13th East, similar size, similar age, is about 450.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where we get the adjustments for it. We just have to prove it. That's where we got the information from. What are some other location factors that sometimes come up?
Well, I think that gives really good information. One of the things that I've never really thought about until you were talking about this, if I'm a buyer looking at homes, there are certain areas where there's just, I want to, there's a big difference. White City, you bringing that up, being above 13th East and being in White City, I feel like those are two completely different neighborhoods. Mm-hmm. But when you're looking at homes, do you know if agents do they look at that the same way, or is this, well, this home's just on the other side of 13th East, I'm going to pull this as a comp to kind of get my value that I'm looking for?
Sure.
It almost seems like a buyer would need to be a little bit more diligent about how did they come up with that value, but that's not even something I would think about until we just had this conversation.
Right, and I get asked that a lot. So if I do an appraisal and someone comes back and they have what's called a value consideration or a reconsideration of value, and say, well, what that is I don't agree with your value. Why didn't you use these comps? And so, if I've missed something, then I'm happy to look at it. But they may send out some sales and say, well, you didn't use this home, and it sold for, let's say, 50,000 above what you appraised it for. And then I look at it and say, well, the reason why is it's 3 miles away. It sold last year, and it's 40 years newer, but it has the same square footage. So most real estate agents, I don't want to make any real estate agent mad because they really do a good job. It's just, that's not a comparable, that's just another sale
Yeah.
that's got the same size.
Mm-hmm.
And I have to go to a lender and say, okay, you are my client. It goes to you. I have to prove to you throughout that report that that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And so if somebody says, well, why don't you use this or that or the other, then for the most part, in residential areas here in Utah, it should be within a mile, but sometimes that's not the case. It should be fairly similar in age. Again, sometimes that can't be the case. And then certain styles of homes, that's going to be different. Is there a split entry that's 2,000 square feet total, the same as a Rambler?
Mm-hmm.
Is a multi-level, meaning you come in, it's flat, and then you go upstairs, up or down, and it's got multiple levels, just like it sounds. Does a two-story, is that different than a Rambler?
Mm-hmm.
So all of those we look at and say, well, did you use this comp for this reason, or did you not use this comp for this reason? So in a perfect world, if I'm appraising this two-story in Harriman, and I've got the two-story next to it, I've got one a block away, and I've got one 2 blocks away, and they're all built by the same builder, which does happen a lot,
Mm-hmm.
actually. That's great.
Yeah.
That doesn't always happen.
Yeah.
So those are the factors that we have to look at.
Real quickly, I don't want to get too far into this, but we look over the appraisals and see all the photos that you take and stuff like that. If you walk into a home and the home's a little bit dirty, there's laundry out, stuff like that. I mean, you're human. How much does that, or the lawn has not been mowed, that sort of stuff, how much does that kind of, or does it at all play into the factor of when you're going through the home of what my daughter would call your feel goods of what you're looking at when you walk into it?
Right. And that's great. That's another question that comes up quite a bit. I'm sorry my house is dirty.
Yeah.
And I usually say to people, if I ask people to clean their house, I'd be a big fat hypocrite. Now, we are appraising, if you were to take your house, turn it upside down, shake everything out, put it back, that's what I'm appraising. I'm not appraising personal property.
Mm-hmm.
Furniture, stuff that's on your carpets, clothes, if it's dirty and stuff like that, that should be, I have to look at a house as if it's vacant.
Okay.
Now, there's things that are permanent that we look at, yes. Does that affect the value if you have a dirty house? It shouldn't. Now, I can't say that there aren't appraisers who come in and say, oh my gosh, this smells terrible.
Mm-hmm.
And you've got your dog climbed on me and your laundry room was terrifying. That shouldn't make a difference. But sometimes there's appraisers that look at it and say, geez, I'm gonna have to give this a different condition rating, so it was absolute pigsty.
Yeah.
If I were to give people advice, and again, it shouldn't matter, but straighten up your house, maybe run the vacuum over your floors, and if an appraiser comes over, if possible, turn on every light in your house. Okay. That has to do with different areas of your home. That way we're not looking for lights, but it also gives a better look of your home.
Mm-hmm.
And, but that's a great question because it shouldn't matter if your home's dirty.
Okay.
No.
So turn on the lights. I like that. I want to talk about square footage real quickly. I know that square footage is not all square footage is equal. I had an individual, and this could be an isolated incident, but I had an individual where we got an appraisal. There are different types of appraisals, and hopefully we can be able to get into that, where there's like a desktop appraisal where somebody is not going to the home. There's a desktop with photos where somebody comes to the home and takes pictures, but they're not the individual doing the appraisal, and then yourself where you actually come into the home, you go around the home and everything like that. So this did have two different types of appraisals, which could be there, but this gentleman had put $50,000 into his basement, and we did the appraisal to be able to then take the home equity and put it all into one loan, and his home value had only gone up $10,000.
Right.
And I know that I had talked to the appraiser afterwards, and I was like, hey, can you give me some information on this? And he's like, oh yeah, his basement is gorgeous. He did a wonderful job. I was looking at the photos, and I'm sitting there, and when I had to make that call and be like, well, your value only went up $10,000. He was really upset, totally understand all the time and effort and money that he had put into it. But when I started talking to the other appraisers, like, well, all square footage is not equal. And so that's one of those things. Talk about square footage not being equal. What's the most valuable square footage, stuff like that.
So the most valuable square footage, at least where we're at here, is, and the way that the market reacts to, is your main level and your upper level. So anything what we call above grade, which means above the dirt in your yard. Mm-hmm. And that's just what people look at and say, well, how big is your home? Well, it's 3,900 square feet. And I'll say, well, do you know how much of that is above grade? And then meaning how much is in your basement versus above the dirt. So That's the most. Then typically your basement after that. Now, the reason for that is what we're reacting to in the market. People say, yes, it's got a finished basement, but my other square footage on the main level and upper level, if I have one, is worth more because that's where I live most of the time. There's certain areas that just have either pockets or the whole area doesn't have basements. And so obviously we try and pull comparables that are similar to that. But basements is a good example because if you say, well, I have in my basement a family room, I have 2 bedrooms, I have a bath, and let's say a laundry room and a utility room where your furnace and your water heater is and it's unfinished. And that could be only 5% of your basement. Okay, your basement's finished. And then they come in and say, well, okay, you appraised this 2 years ago, but now I took one of those bedrooms and I made a kind of a mini theater room, and I put a wet bar in the family room, and it was $22,000. That's kind of cheap for a theater room.
Yeah.
But we have to look and say, okay, is that desirable? Yes. What I call a functional basement is what I said at the beginning, which is a family room, couple of bedrooms and a bathroom. Right now, we're seeing a lot more kitchens, ADUs coming up because people want to supplement their income. Absolutely. And it looks like there's more availability of legality and zoning to say you can have an ADU.
Yep.
So if someone comes in and they say, hey, I put a kitchen in, full kitchen, meaning an oven, a sink, and a fridge at minimum. It doesn't have to have a dishwasher, but those are kind of the minimum for. Okay. That's going to be worth more than somebody coming in and saying, hey, I spent $40,000 on this really sweet theater room.
Yeah.
Because of the nature of the functionality of that property. And that's the market again saying your kitchen and your basement is worth more than a theater room. Sometimes showpieces like a bar, a wet bar, a rec room, a theater room can be worth something, an exercise room. I see those a little bit more now. If everything else is functional, you're going to get more dollar for dollar, but just be wary of having a contractor come in and do some things that may not add value to your house as much as you think. Now, is that 10 grand justifiable that the appraiser gave? I'm not sure because I haven't seen the report. But a good thing to do is if you're going to remodel anything in your house, talk to your lender and maybe even call an appraiser and say, hey, can you just kind of look at some comparables in the area? Is this, if I get an appraisal, is this going to add value, or how much do you think it would add? And that's a good thing to do.
So the $10,000 and just that increase, it may not, if I'm understanding this correctly, it may not have had as much to do with his basement, but what he did to the basement and what was around his home.
Right.
Okay.
Exactly.
That makes sense.
And there's some that do it. People are putting in pools. When I first started in the business, a pretty nice gunite, which is a concrete pools, let's say 18 by 30, costs about $60,000. Now, if you do that, it's probably around $150,000. And I get asked, does a pool add value? Well, it depends. If I have a very expensive home in an area that has predominantly pools, then yes, it's going to add value, and it's probably going to be what people expect when they buy it. If you're in a home that may be a little bit less expensive and you're putting in a pool, some people may say, that is awesome, that is wonderful. I use it for 4 months.
Yeah.
So that could be a detracting factor in what you're putting into your house, but that's why do the research, whatever you do to your house, look at it and say, well, I want to do this because I want to revalue my home or get a HELOC or sell it. Do some research before you start that construction process to see what's going on in your specific market.
Well, not all things that you do to your home have to be value driven. Like there is some benefit to you as an individual that you get to have the pool and you get to enjoy all of that. So it's not necessarily just the value that you're getting out of what you're putting into it. Some things you do get more value than other things.
Right.
You talked about style of home. I'm thinking, I live in Sandy, multifamily, split level entries, they're everywhere. Ramblers, raised ramblers. Obviously, if you have more square footage, as you said, on the upper floor as above grade is going to make a difference. does the type of home make a big difference in a neighborhood?
Usually it does, because people are looking at a house to buy it for a specific reason. Now, when we look at, let's say it's a split entry, you come in the front door, you have a little landing, it goes up or it goes down.
Mm-hmm.
That's a split entry. That may depend on the area, because
Okay.
I grew up in Cottonwood Heights, and I think every other home's a split entry,
Yeah.
built from 1968 to 1979.
Yeah.
And some people like that, but that means you're coming in your garage for the most part, and you go into your basement, and then you have to walk upstairs.
Mm-hmm.
So no matter what in your house, you're going to be up or downstairs. And I like to compare other homes to similar styles. For the most part, a Rambler versus a split entry, the Rambler is going to be worth more per square foot, or at least comparing it to other Ramblers versus split entries. There's lots of different kinds of multi-level properties. So most of them, you come in, you have a living room, a kitchen, it may go down a few steps to a family room, and then from the living room, it goes up to a second level, and then sometimes you have a basement or two different levels of basements.
Yeah.
And that's probably going to be worth more than a split entry for the most part. 2 stories in Ramblers, it kind of depends, because it's cheaper to build a 2-story if you're looking at total square footage versus a Rambler, because you've already built your foundation. But now I'm building, instead of this amount of square footage for Rambler, I've got another level of, we call it sticks, that we build above, but with just foundation.
Yeah.
And you get, if you've got a more narrow lot, you get more square footage if you do a 2-story versus a Rambler.
Okay.
So those kind of things, I would say Ramblers and 2 stories, it kind of depends, but they're fairly comparable. And then probably multi-levels, and then split entries from there. But again, I've done certain areas where the person wanted the split entry more than they wanted the Rambler.
Yeah.
It's just a little bit more rare.
Well, yeah, and that's one of the things that my wife and her family hate, the split entry homes. And one of the things that I look at it, one of the things that I like about split entry homes is I understand what they're saying. As you said, you have to walk into the garage for the most part. If you walk into the front door and the door swings, you either have to be on the downstairs stairs or the upstairs stairs, because that door is there.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I like about it is that it seems like the basement is not in the ground. Only half of it is in the ground, which lets in a lot of natural light. So I've always thought that basements of split level homes are much more desirable than a Rambler. But whenever you talk to somebody, and me personally, if I had to buy a home, I would want a Rambler over a split level home. So talked about that with the basements themselves. Like, is larger windows, more light, does that help in terms of basement value or anything that comes up with that?
Yes, and I'll go into that. And it's good because what we call a daylight basement means you don't have a window in your basement that's got a window well.
Okay.
It means you're looking out onto either a slightly sloping hill, flat, or it goes down. And the home I own in Harriman, we have a Rambler, and it's what's called a walkout basement, which means when you're in the basement, you can walk out to your patio and you don't have to go down or up.
Okay.
And those typically, per, looking at homes that do have it versus that don't, whether it's a daylight and then a walkout and then one that doesn't have it, the daylight is in the middle, the walkout's probably gonna be worth more, and then the one that doesn't have it is going to be worth a little bit less. And again, looking at the market reaction to that, most people, like you said, if you're in the basement, it feels like you're in a dungeon. That makes a difference. If you're in the basement, you're like, it kind of feels like I'm in my living room upstairs, because I have bigger windows. The sun is coming in, and I want that more, or I can walk right out to my backyard from it. So, and it also gives you advantages for a walkout or a basement entrance, if down the road, if you ever want to do an accessory unit.
Yeah, I'm not sure how much people could be able, your home is what your home is, but it kind of leads into my next thing with builds, kind of shift gears. So we have a lot of people building new homes. Talk about the finishes of a new build. And so when we've got people who they'll buy a home, they don't do any finishes, compared to somebody who will buy the same home and put $100,000 into upgrading tile and all those things. How much do the finishes, I'm thinking that they increase the value a lot from what we talked about with fixtures and different stuff like that, but you do have, even though a fixture may not be wow, it is new.
Mhm.
So talk about finishes with a build and how that will affect the value of a home.
Okay, so when you build a new home, let's say you're using a builder, you didn't do it yourself. And most people have done this where you go down and you have a pricing sheet. And you say, well, okay, for us to upgrade your countertops in your kitchen from granite to quartz, then it's going to be this much.
Okay.
Or you have a quartz countertop that's got a 2-inch reveal versus a 4-inch reveal. Now that's kind of a in the weeds type of thing, but that from a builder can get pretty expensive.
Yeah.
Hey, we put an arch in this doorway versus just a flat doorway. That's $1,400.
Yeah.
It's 50 grand. In this market right now, and I'm just talking about right now, a lot of times you're not getting as much dollar for dollar because people just want to move in and be in a house right now because the interest rates are higher. And they want to be in a neighborhood that they want. And I said, down the road, I'm going to do that myself. But right now, I'm okay with possibly fiberglass surrounds in my showers versus something that's tile or cultured marble or something else. Some builders have minimum things that they put in. I think Garbett Hall actually more and more doing tankless water heaters. Does that make a difference? I don't see it too much, but more and more are going that route. Or they say, well, we're going to put in nicer fixtures, and that's just your standard package. But you're not getting as much out of the nicer things, but you're definitely getting more because people that are moving into a home say, I don't want to have to worry about it down the road. So you kind of get both sides of it. And I've had homes that come, I get the purchase contract and then I get the builder's cost breakdown, and the home next door looks identical to it. And they've done 2 or 3 different things. They got a really expensive appliance package. I think they finished a room in the basement, 1 room, and then I think their carpet and pad was like the nicest. And it was like $46,000 difference. Ooh. And no other comps in the area were even close. And they said, well, we put in this nice stuff. And I said, well, I'm just reacting to the market. It's not going to give you as much as you think. So if you're the biggest fish, so to speak, in the neighborhood versus somebody that kind of fits in but isn't doing too much, just be wary because sometimes that won't give you dollar for dollar from a builder aspect of what you're putting into your home.
Okay. So this was a question I wanted to ask this earlier and I forgot. Talk about the difference between a refinance appraisal and a purchase appraisal and the information that you're getting when you go to do that. Because I'm thinking about from that perspective, if I'm spending $10,000 on upgraded carpet and an upgraded pad, well, yes, it is nicer, but I wouldn't think that would add value to the home. So that's where just kind of, if we're looking at when you see the purchase, well, you explain that when you're getting the purchase compared to a refinance.
Okay. So when we're getting a purchase, are you saying new construction or just anything?
If there would be a difference, either of them.
Yeah. So when I get an assignment to do an appraisal and the intended use is for a purchase, and let's say it's a new home, I get the purchase price and I get any concessions that would be made, whether that's, the buyer's going to pay your closing costs, the buyer's going to buy down your rate, whatever that is, or excuse me, the seller is going to do that. We look at that. And then we look at, if it's a new build, what kind of things went into the house. Outside of, I'm going to walk through the house and see it firsthand, but also what they put into the house. And then we look at what the comps are doing. So that's a physical aspect of a home that's already existing. Now, some of the things when you're looking at a property, you want to make sure you've got all that information correct, but it's also, okay, does it add or detract? I shouldn't say detract. Does it add to value or not on a purchase? And that's just the nature of when you agree to a price. Let's say it's $700,000 house. Does that mean I'm going to appraise it for 702? Sometimes it comes in that way because during that process of purchasing that home, you have a buyer and you have a seller that have already gone through the process, and they're both willing to sell it and buy it for a certain amount. That's how you get technically market value is emotion.
That makes sense.
People says, well, I think it's worth that much. And the seller's like, well, I don't. And then they negotiate back and forth and
Yeah.
they say, well, both of them are agreeing an arm's length transaction. That's how much it should be worth.
Mhm.
And that's where we come in. So if it's 700 and I appraise it for 640, something went wrong. Hopefully it's not that the appraiser's crappy,
Mhm.
but it should be relatively close to that because a seller doesn't want to leave money on the table and a
Yeah.
buyer doesn't want to pay too much.
Yeah.
So it should be relatively in there if the comparables that I can prove show that.
Okay.
Sometimes it may be higher. It's rare, but sometimes it comes in lower because there's just nothing else that proves
Yeah.
that value.
So to bring this back to the build with the same information, is that one of the things that I typically see is that older homes, that's where I get more of a variation in terms of what the appraised value comes in at compared to what the purchase price is.
Okay.
Versus a new build where I've only had 2 instances where somebody's building a new home and the value didn't come in where it needed to.
Gotcha.
So, and when I think about how much money you can be able to put into a home in terms of extra over the base price, it seems like it should be the other way around, where there should be more value, not lost, but they're putting a lot more money into, or they're being charged a lot more than what the actual value would be of that home.
Mhm.
So that's where I guess the question is that, do you agree with that assessment, and how are values determined in terms of a new build with the different stuff that we've talked about?
That's a tough one. I agree with you that it kind of feels like it should be the other way around. But a lot of that may depend on, is you're valuing a home or you go through the process of purchasing a home. It depends on what your market doing right now. Is there a high demand for it? It's rare, but there's people that buy things sight unseen. They're like, I got to have it. I have a realtor. They said, hey, this is available. Do you have your earnest money? Are you ready to buy it? And they're like, yes, just take it. Like, okay, it's got this. Well, I don't care. Can I live in it? Yes, you can. But you need to have the offer in today. Now, the beginning of last year in 2021, it was nuts. I mean, people were getting multiple offers on their homes, and the agents were like, oh my gosh, we have 20 offers on this home.
Yeah.
And the beginning purchase price, the starting purchase price was 500, and it ended up at 550.
I had one where the agents listed the home, and over the weekend they got so many offers so high up, they actually removed the listing, declined all of the offers, and then listed it the next week for $100,000 more, which was higher than any of the other any of the offers that they got, and they ended up still getting above list price. And it was one of those things where they weren't very experienced agents, but I was just like, I couldn't believe what I just saw take place at that time.
It was crazy. And that whole, I don't know if that answers your question, but sometimes that comes into play in valuing properties to say, well, Spence, this home sold in February of this year, and we're appraising it in June of 2023. Is there a difference? Well, I put in my appraisals some grids and some graphs that show what the market's been doing over the past year.
Yeah.
And we have to look at that and say, well, the average purchase price of a comparable home in February was $492, and now it's $515. And I mean, the best way to do it is to have comparables that are sold very recently, but sometimes you can't. So we make time adjustments if the market says you need to do a time adjustment.
Yeah.
And again, that was happening a lot in 2020 and 2021 because the market was exponentially increasing so fast. Now, does that mean it's worth whatever that person offers for that house? No, not necessarily, because you have to prove that in the market that something else is happening. So there were appraisal conditions in a lot of the reps used to say, if it doesn't appraise for this value, then we will pay a certain amount above the agreed upon price.
Standard.
So it really is tracking the market, and right now there's a lot of demand, and so some of those factors may be different.
Yeah.
When people look at a home or they look to sell their house.
So just to finish up on that. So I know I've built 2 homes, and I've talked to many people who have built homes. One thing that's never crossed my mind when I'm going through and picking out what I want in my home and how much it's going to cost is this home going to appraise for purchase price that I'm buying it for, with adding
Right.
all of those things.
Right.
I've never heard anybody talk about that. So is that something people should be concerned with, or do you think that that's never really going to be an issue?
I think it probably depends on if you're selling it yourself, for sale by owner, or if you have an agent. I mean, that's what we pay agents to do, is to make sure that they're doing their job in looking at what the pricing should be on that home, so that you're not leaving money on the table, but you're also not overpricing your home so it sits on the market forever.
Okay.
And also if they say, well, we got all these offers and we offered 700,000 and the appraisal came in at 660, and then we got another appraisal came in at 665. And then they have to go back to the negotiating table, and it creates a problem.
Okay.
So if you have an agent, then make sure that they know that, okay, I'm kind of worried about this price. It seems like we're kind of high. They should come back to you and say, well, here's the other homes that have sold. Here's the similar features to yours, and this is why I priced your home at what I did. If you're selling it yourself for sale by owner to try and save that money, that's fine. I would always recommend either talking to a realtor or an appraiser and saying, here's what I'm doing. Can you either give me an appraisal? Can you talk to me about this process? And we do that in our business, where I'm not just an appraiser, I'm a consultant, to say, okay, let me talk through some of this with you just to make sure that I'm not underpricing it. That's the biggest thing, is I don't want to put it up for sale and then leave 10% on the table because I didn't do my due diligence.
Okay. A couple last things I want to talk about real quickly, and then we'll get to the questions. Renewable energy. It's a topic that we hear everywhere. It's become a political topic, which is crazy to me. But we're not seeing wind turbines as much on homes, although it's something that is available for people. You are seeing solar. From a financial perspective and loans, it is a pain in the butt, but just because the salesman never gives the correct information on how they actually take care of that stuff. But how does it help in terms of value? What am I getting if I put in $25,000 solar panel system that offsets my energy 100%? What kind of value am I getting in terms of the appraisal? I know there's going to be as an individual that wants to buy that home, there may be more appeal to something like that, but what does it actually give in terms of value?
Okay, so when we look at homes, and I think 98% honestly of what people are doing to supplement their power costs for green energy, so to speak, is solar. I've done some geothermal stuff here and there, but it's not as prevalent. So let's say solar, and right now it's expensive. The things that we look at are, how is the market reacting to, like you said, let's say a system on a good sun day, meaning where it's sunny and it supplements all your power. And typically all you're paying is your connection fee to Rocky Mountain Power, which is like $7 or $8 a month. So you're kind of a power plant yourself. That, if it's a $30,000 system, if I can find other homes that have solar, great. It is more prevalent now. For the most part, what's happening now is it's about, give or take, 25% to 35% of the value that you put into that solar is you're getting back in value if you sell the house.
Okay. That's good news, because I know I asked you the same question probably 4 years ago, and I want to say that you told me 10 to 20%. So it seems like the number's growing.
And again, it depends. Some areas, it's like people say, I want this when I buy a house. Now, on the multiple listing service, the Wasatch Front MLS, where I look at homes that have sold, there is a line item that says, is the solar financed or is it owned? Now, if it's financed, that means that they're transferring a contract with a solar power company to the buyer. And they have to agree to that as an asset or an amenity, a personal property. Because
does that decrease the value of the home?
Not necessarily, but that's maybe a negotiating thing. Like, hey, I still owe 11,000. But
99% of the time that we see in that situation, I've only had it once where it actually transferred to the buyer. The seller is just part of their proceeds, where they just pay that. It's very rare that I see that move over to the new owner.
In the same way, and sometimes during the contract, they're like, hey, there's 8,000 left on the loan, or they transfer the contract from the seller to the buyer and say, well, instead of paying $250 a month, you're paying $130 a month, but you still have 12 years left on solar panels.
Mhm.
The other thing that we're seeing is, trying to look at what the market is reacting to is the life of the panel. Because most people that build the system say, well, after 10 years, they're running at about 80% efficiency. And beyond that, we haven't had them long enough to see a full life.
Yeah.
Except for the homes that are really old.
Mhm.
And those systems are a little bit less efficient anyway. They're trying to do it, but it's a tough one because I've had appraisers say they're not worth anything.
Mhm.
Now, if you can't prove it in the market that they're worth something, that's kind of true.
Yeah.
But others are saying that this, I had 3 offers and they bought the home, and one of the main things they liked was the solar.
Mhm.
And so you may have areas where people want that, and others where they're like, well, it's kind of ugly. It's on the front of the house, and it's.
That's
And
true.
then does that void my roof warranty?
Mm.
What if I want to move those panels when I move?
Yeah.
Which you can, but you have big bolts that are now bolted
Yeah.
into your roof.
Mhm.
And that's one of those things that is just depends on the buyer and seller.
Yeah, it sounds like then solar is one of those things where it's kind of an appeal. It's kind of like a jetted tub. Like the jetted tub may be really expensive. You're not going to get the value out of it, but you do get the enjoyment out of it. Pool we talked about.
Sure.
So that's something to be able to think about.
Yep.
One other thing that I want to touch base on is that I know I put solar on my roof. I just did a standard system. I'm on the grid. When the grid goes down, my power is not on, even though my panels are still collecting energy if it's sunny outside.
Mhm.
Some people are paying for batteries to be installed, or that they have a generator where they can be able to still have power when they're off the grid.
Mhm.
Is that something that you take into account? Are they getting any value out of that? Are they still getting that 25 to 35% value, or is it just on the solar system itself?
Typically, they are getting value. Most battery systems, I mean, we've sometimes seen the Tesla systems
Mhm.
where you have something, you plug your Tesla in, plus it runs either all of or a portion of the power of your house in stored energy.
Yeah.
And typically from solar. Yes, it does add value. Those are just very expensive, typically systems.
Yeah.
And so I haven't done enough to really give a genuine answer on that.
Okay.
But right now, it's definitely worth more than something without it. The generator backup that you sometimes see at Costco, it's a natural gas or gasoline or kerosene run thing that when your power goes off, that turns on. That's one of those that's kind of like a hot tub.
Okay.
Can you take it with you? Yes.
Yeah.
Is it expensive to do that? Yes, but some people keep them and some people leave them with the house and say, I'm just going to sell you that with it.
Okay.
So that could be on a case by case basis, how much that's worth.
Next thing, rural living versus urban and suburban living. One of the things that I saw really in the early parts of COVID, which made me believe that people had been thinking about this prior to, but the transition of people being able to stay at home. They were told when COVID started, you're going to be home for the next 3 years. You're going to be home for the next 5 years. That's what we're transitioning to.
Right.
And it seems like a lot of those companies are not ever going to bring those people back. If they're comfortable working at home, the company is comfortable having them be there. Are you seeing, or couldn't you give an opinion on the rural living values? Are those increasing at the same percentage as they are in urban, suburban? Is there a better place to live? Is there a place where people can get in on the ground floor? Because like Homes and Price, different places like that, they're still relatively, I don't want to use the word cheap, but they are much less expensive than if you were going to buy a home in Midvale, Sandy, Draper, something like that.
Right. So I started in 2004, and one of the main areas that was just exploding was not Saratoga Springs, well, that as well, but Stansbury Park. And so people were moving out there at that point, were moving into new homes, and they typically work downtown Salt Lake City, and they said, this is a faster commute for me than if I lived in South Jordan, Draper, or like South Sandy. And I'm getting a new house, I'm getting a bigger house, and it's 70% of the cost of what I would do there. And that was kind of a big thing. And then that community eventually got big enough that they have their own, once you get enough rooftops, then you start to get a Costco or a Sam's Club or a Smith's or a movie theater. And so it's self-contained. I live in Harriman, and again, I moved in 2002, and my wife and I, the first night, it was so quiet that it freaked us out because we lived in West Jordan, and it was kind of loud, but like there's nothing going on. It's kind of creepy. Anyway. So rural areas, let's say right now, maybe Wasatch County, which is more of kind of a mountain community,
Mhm.
versus let's say Erta, which is just south of Stansbury Park, in between there and Tooele. Let's call those rural areas, because what that typically means is you're going to have less dense homes. You may have homes that are on an acre or 5 acres, and those are kind of a hot commodity
Mhm.
for the most part. People are paying more to say, I want to live a little bit further away because I don't have to go into work,
Yeah.
or I have to go into work a lot less. The other communities in, let's say, areas south of Utah County, I'm not as familiar with. Morgan County, there's been a lot of building, but those are kind of expensive as well. But there are suburban communities, but they're suburban communities 2 or 3 miles from anything else.
Mhm.
So I think Eden, which is up Ogden Canyon,
Mhm.
is building a ski community, ski in, ski out. And no one would thought that would ever happen.
Yeah.
But those areas that you would call rural are gaining traction for sure. I just haven't done enough outside of this main Wasatch Front area, but everyone's going that route. Like, well, I'm kind of sick of the traffic in Salt
Yeah.
Lake. I want to move somewhere else.
Okay.
So the more that happens, the more values are going to go up.
Okay. All right. We're going to move to some questions that we got from people. Thank you. How do we get the free appraisal offer? Well, that's going to be for me. So when we get done with this, you should receive an email that states that if you do a transaction with us, that you will get $500. I believe we're not doing the appraisal anymore. It's $500 off your closing costs. Yeah, so it used to be just on the appraisal, but we got to a point with COVID, it's kind of gone away where we were, Spence doesn't want to hear this, but we get the appraisal waiver, so we wouldn't have to do the appraisals on the home. So that's why we moved to the closing costs. So I don't have anything, or we don't have anything where you can just be able to get just an appraisal for free. However, that's where agents can be really good, valuable assets to be able to get a CMA, and so they can give you a value on your home, and it allow you to touch base with your agent. Somebody inherited their parents' home and the value has gone up significantly. Do I need an appraisal if I plan to sell the home down the road? What do you think of that?
Sometimes when they inherit a home, I've done quite a few appraisals over the years for an estate.
Okay.
And that's their accountant says, hey, you need to value this property for your estate.
Mm-hmm.
And then I come out and do a full appraisal. I definitely recommend that. If that's the case where they say you need it for a tax purpose,
okay,
to have that in the estate, you should get an appraisal done.
Okay.
If they're going to sell it and they want to sell it themselves,
Mm-hmm.
again, I would probably get an appraisal done and say, we want to do it ourselves. We're not quite sure what the value is. Can you come out and just give us an opinion of value on that?
So one of the times that I recommend people to you, it's typically divorce. That's when I usually will have that. And so how much does an appraisal cost if you have a couple who's splitting? They need to start with a bit so they can be able to know what the value of the home is, so they can be able to decide how they're going to split that, whatever way they're going to. Sure. How much does an appraisal cost for that individual?
So if what we call a non-complex property, what that means is it's in a reasonable area. It doesn't have a huge tract of land, and it's not something that's unique. If you have a geodesic dome, that may be a little bit more because that takes more time. It's $500 for a full appraisal, meaning that's what I do for a lender. I come out, we measure the property, do everything we would do, taking pictures, we write up the full report, that's $500.
Okay.
And then on demand, or depending on if it's a bigger home or a more expensive home in an area, then it's just on a per basis.
Okay, excellent. My thing, do I need an appraisal if you plan to sell it down the road? I don't think that you would need one at this point. Once again, we get you in touch with an appraiser an agent that we work with if that's something that you need. Really, the value of your home is nice to be able to have that, but it's just like anything. Until you sell it, that's only worth you living in it. There's not any monetary value that you're gaining from that unless you're making money off of it. So it's not something that I would think would be important. Does an exterior entrance to a basement or a basement apartment add value to a home? I would definitely think so.
Yes, it does. And again, we were talking about this earlier. ADUs, which are accessory dwelling units, are becoming more prevalent. People want to either supplement or they have kids that are moving back in. Does it add value? Yes. For the most part, how much, again, on a case-by-case basis, that depends, but those are becoming a lot more prevalent.
So I know Salt Lake County just allowed for ADUs. They changed their rules, so it's going to be something. Now, each individual city, for my understanding, still has to approve those sorts of things, but the
Correct.
county has given the green light on that.
Mhm.
If you've got an individual, I've got two questions, so we'll start with the ADUs first. So if somebody wants to build an ADU, are they getting the same value that they would if they're adding on to their home? Obviously, if they're building an ADU, it's typically for income generation purposes, but how much are they getting in terms of the value of their home compared to if they were to build an extension on the home?
Oh, it's going to be a lot cheaper, obviously, to do an existing basement space
Okay.
and do an ADU. Now, there's some rules and regulations. If you have an above grade ADU, let's say you have a garage. We've seen this in a few areas that have an attached garage, and they turn that into an ADU, and it's not very big, maybe 300 or 400 square feet.
Mm-hmm.
And there's just certain things you just need to make sure are legal per your zoning to have 2 kitchens above grade.
Okay.
So basement is cheaper to do that way. If you do something that's separate, let's say you have a detached garage that you're building, you say we want to put something above that, that's separate. That's going to be more, but typically you're going to get more rent for that because it's separate.
Yeah.
And depending on how many rooms you have, a lot of the rentals for residential right now are depending on how many bedrooms you have, how many bathrooms, and then obviously everything legally needs to have a kitchen and some type of a living space if you call it an ADU.
Yeah. Hey, the thing that's interesting to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, or your thoughts, and then from the appraiser's perspective, but somebody built a separate ADU, I would think that that would be much more valuable to my property than if I were to build that same amount of square footage, as in I'm just living in that square footage. So
Right.
if I'm spending dollar for dollar, let's say each of them cost $200,000 to do that, I'm thinking that ADU is going to be much more valuable. From what I've understood in the past, the ADU doesn't get as much value in terms of the square footage as it would if it were inside my home. Can you talk about those two things?
Yeah, and it doesn't. If it's a separate ADU, you don't get as much value for your square footage. Now, depending on the appraiser and the appraisal process, you could add that as square footage and just explain it so that everyone understands what you're doing on your adjustments. Or you could do what's called a separate line item adjustment. Say, hey, this home has an accessory dwelling unit, and then describe it. It's this big, it's got these features, it's above the garage, it's behind the garage, it's completely separate. And then it's my job to make sure that what that ADU is legal. You know, some zonings, we don't allow that here. And so that makes a difference because in valuing that property, then I have to note if that's legal or not for the value of the home.
Okay. This is a really good question. Does real wood flooring, and I'm a sucker for real wood flooring, but you rarely see it in homes these days, but is real wood flooring throughout, does that add value compared to carpet?
Yes. And again, that will depend on if you have a 600 square foot condo, that's great, 1 bedroom, 1 bath, and you spend $4,000 on hardwood flooring, you're not going to get that money out of it. If your whole house is hardwood flooring and nothing else, which is rare, that's probably not going to be good either. But for the most part, people like that aesthetic look of hardwood for the look. Now, LVP, which is the engineered flooring, if you have pets with claws of any type or kids with claws, then you're going to want to have something like that because it holds up better and it looks better. So we're talking about functionality versus I really like this hardwood flooring. And hardwood flooring looks great. But just take that into account before you do it. Is it going to give you more than carpet? Yes. For the most part, the market reacts better to hardwood flooring. But just be careful if you're going to sell it and say, I'm going to put a bunch of hardwood flooring in, and somebody buys it and says, I've got a dog, I got to take this out.
Yeah.
It's going to scratch up that flooring.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Last question, just from my own. Every house now seems to have a 3rd car garage. if we're looking at a 1980s home, 2-car garage, let's say that it's a 2-story home compared to what's being built now. I know that location plays a big role into that, but when you're comparing those from an appraisal perspective, are they even comparable? Like, is it more just like the location and the type of home that's there, and we shouldn't compare these two types of subdivisions, and it's just like, well, if I want to live here, this is what I get. If I want to live here, this is what I get. Why are those things being, I guess, I don't understand the 3-car garage personally. It just doesn't, it just seems like you're just paying for a storage unit in your garage. But I guess from an appraisal perspective, like, what are your thoughts on those sorts of things when you're seeing the new homes that are built and what's on them, what's standard and what's not? What's your thought process on those?
So 3-car garages are, most of the builder, when they break down how much it costs, let's say they have a 2-car standard house and they say, well, your option is you're going to build a 3-car garage.
Mm-hmm.
And so most of them are between about 15 and 25,000 to build that extra garage, depending on the style of home and the roof lines and engineering and so forth. So is it worth that much more than a 2-car garage? Not necessarily, but it's getting closer and closer. So you're saying, Taylor, it's a good point. I think literally over 90% of the 3-car garages I see, 1 to 2 cars are parked in it at most.
Yeah.
And the rest is my kids' bikes.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of my shed, like you had said. So they don't park 3 cars in it,
mm-hmm.
but they love to have that extra space because they're like, if I didn't have this, I'm gonna have a shed in my yard.
Yeah.
I'm gonna have something else that I'm gonna be storing that stuff in.
Makes
so
sense.
That's a definite market factor where people say, well, this has a 2-car garage, but this has a 3-car garage.
No, that makes sense. So you're talking about, you got 3-car garage, that's a de facto shed. Does a nice shed in the backyard add value to a home, or is it more of when I go see a home, I'm like, oh, that's a nice shed from a man's perspective. I can put all my stuff in there that it doesn't have to be in my garage. That's something like that just add more appeal, or is there actual value that gets added to the home for that?
Remember, Taylor, there are she sheds.
Yeah, that's true.
They're out there, yeah. It does add value. Okay. Now, if it's an 8x8 shed, it's probably not going to be as much, but let's say I put in a 12x16 shed, it's a tough shed, or an A shed or something that's got a nice concrete floor, you run power to it. And most people that have that, if it's in a legitimate space in your yard where it's not taking up your whole yard,
mm-hmm.
that's going to add value.
Mm-hmm.
We bought a shed 7 or 8 years, maybe longer, and it was about that size, and I think it was $3,500. Mm-hmm. Now they're obviously more, but that does add value. And again, on a case-by-case basis, how much does that add to your home? Mm-hmm. Most people that see that, whether they have a 3rd-car garage or not, are like, I like to have that shed. That's nice.
Yeah.
Tin sheds, some of the smaller barn sheds, not as much. And if it's in bad shape, it probably doesn't add any value. It may detract if the potential buyer has to remove it.
Makes sense.
Yep.
Okay. James, are there any other questions that we had? No? All right. Well, I appreciate that, Spence. This was great. I could sit here for hours and be able to talk about this stuff, but we'll close this at an end. I appreciate everybody who could be able to come out and listen today. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me at the credit union. We'll send out some information. You're more than welcome to be able to call the mortgage hotline directly at 801-481-8840. You can also contact me on my office phone and my cell phone. We'll get all that information out so that we can be able to be accessible for you. If you need an appraisal, I know I always recommend Spence. He's timely to be able to get out. How long does it usually take to get an appraisal back? 7 days? At
most. Okay. I usually say right now we're between 3 and 5 business days. Okay. From start to finish of the process.
So if it's something that you need, something that you want, it can be good for will purposes and those sorts of things. Spence can be able to get you taken care of on that. If you have any questions about appraisals, mortgage, or anything like that, feel free to get in contact with us so that we can be able to help you out. Thank you and have a great day.